When I walked into the living room that evening, something felt different. It wasn't the soft glow of the lamps or the familiar scent of the candles I had just lit. It was the way Nick, my 20-year-old stepson, watched me from across the room. His eyes didn't just glance over me like usual, they lingered, trailing over my figure in a way that made my pulse quicken. I was wearing a simple silk robe, nothing too revealing. But under Nick's intense gaze, it suddenly felt like I was standing there in nothing at all. I caught his eyes and smiled awkwardly, trying to play it cool, but inside, something stirred, something I didn't quite understand yet. "Did you need something?" I asked, my voice calm, though my heart was already racing. Nick hesitated, rubbing the back of his neck like he always did when he was nervous. "No, I was just thinking." "Fenton?" "About what?" I didn't press him, but the tension in the room thickened. I could feel his eyes on me even after I turned away, trying to focus on anything but the strange energy that hung between us. That evening wasn't the first time things had felt off. Over the past few weeks, Nick had been acting differently. At first, I didn't notice it. He was always polite, reserved, and respectful, never crossing any boundaries. But lately, something had changed. He started showing up wherever I was in the house. If I was in the kitchen, he'd appear, offering to help with dinner. If I was watching TV, he'd casually sit beside me, a little too close. And the way he looked at me, it wasn't the look of a son toward his stepmother. It was something else, something I couldn't quite name but felt deep in my gut. At first, I brushed it off, telling myself it was nothing. Boys his age are curious, I thought. It's just a phase. But the way he lingered in doorways, the way his eyes would follow me when he thought I wasn't looking, it was more than just curiosity. One night, after my husband had gone to bed early, Nick and I were left alone in the living room. I was curled up on the couch, reading a book, when he sat down beside me. Too close again. His knee brushed mine, and I felt a spark of something that I couldn't ignore anymore. "You look tired," he said softly, his voice unusually gentle. I smiled, trying to ease the growing tension. "Long day, that's all." But he didn't move away. Instead, he leaned in just a little, his eyes searching mine as if he was waiting for something. There was a moment, a fleeting second, where the air between us crackled, charged with something forbidden. I felt my breath hitch, my fingers gripping the book tighter. This wasn't right. This was my stepson. But in that moment, it didn't feel wrong. It felt dangerous. I knew I should have said something, set a boundary, but I didn't. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something else, but I let the moment pass. Nick didn't push any further that night, but his eyes told me everything. This wasn't over. And deep down, a part of me didn't want it to be. The days that followed were filled with more of the same tension. Nick found excuses to be near me, and I found myself both dreading and anticipating those moments. I knew it was dangerous, but I couldn't stop wondering what he was thinking. Or worse, what I was feeling. And then, one evening, it happened. Something that changed everything. And trust me, it only gets crazier from here. The next day, Nick's behavior didn't change, in fact, it intensified. Wherever I went, he wasn't far behind. If I was in the kitchen, he'd suddenly appear, leaning against the counter with that same unreadable expression. When I went to the living room to relax with a book, he sat on the opposite couch, watching me a little too intently. At first, I tried to ignore it. He's just being friendly, I told myself. But the way he looked at me wasn't just friendly, it was something else entirely. There was an edge to his gaze, a quiet intensity that made my skin tingle in a way I wasn't ready to admit. "Need something, Nick?" I asked casually, trying to keep my tone light, though my heart pounded in my chest. "No," he said, smiling faintly. "Just keeping you company." "You don't mind, do you?" I shook my head, forcing a smile, but inside, I felt cornered. The air between us was thick with something unspoken, something I didn't dare acknowledge. As the evening wore on, I grew more and more aware of Nick's presence. Every glance, every casual brush of his hand against mine, felt deliberate. It was as if he was testing boundaries, waiting to see how far he could go before I stopped him. At one point, while I was tidying up the kitchen, he came up behind me. I didn't hear him approach until he was right there, close enough that I could feel the warmth of his body. "You missed a spot," he said softly, reaching around me to grab a towel. His arm brushed mine, and I froze for a moment, caught off guard by the sudden proximity. "Thanks," I muttered, stepping away quickly, my heart racing. This was getting out of hand. I needed to put some distance between us, fast. Later that night, I retreated to my bedroom, hoping for some peace. But even there, I couldn't escape the lingering tension. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Nick's face, his eyes filled with that strange mix of curiosity and something deeper. I told myself it was nothing, just a phase he was going through. He's young, I thought. He doesn't know any better. But deep down, I knew that wasn't true. Nick knew exactly what he was doing. And worse, a part of me was starting to wonder what it would be like if I didn't stop him. The following morning, things only got more complicated. I was in the living room, scrolling through my phone, when Nick walked in, freshly showered. His hair was damp, and he was wearing a plain white t-shirt that clung to his chest. He sat down next to me, a little too close once again. "Morning," he said, his voice low and casual. "Morning," I replied, trying to focus on my phone, but I could feel his eyes on me. I didn't have to look to know he was watching me closely, as if waiting for me to react. "You know," he began after a moment, "you're really beautiful." I froze, my fingers tightening around the phone. I turned to look at him, searching his face for any sign that he was joking. But he wasn't. His expression was serious, his eyes locked on mine. "Nick," I started, unsure of what to say. This was crossing a line, one we couldn't afford to cross. "I mean it," he said, his voice soft but firm. "I've been thinking about it for a while now. You're not just my stepmom. You're different." Different? What was he trying to say? My heart pounded in my chest as I struggled to find the right words. This wasn't just a harmless crush, it was something more, something dangerous. "You shouldn't say things like that," I said finally, keeping my voice steady. "It's inappropriate." Nick didn't flinch. Instead, he leaned in slightly, closing the small gap between us. "But what if it's true?" His words hung in the air, heavy with implication. I felt a rush of heat rise to my cheeks, a mix of embarrassment and something else I didn't want to name. "Nick, this has to stop," I said firmly, standing up. "We can't. This isn't right." For a moment, he just looked at me, his expression unreadable. Then he nodded slowly, as if processing my words. "Okay," he said quietly. "But you can't tell me you don't feel it too." I didn't respond. I couldn't. Because the truth was, I didn't know what I felt anymore. All I knew was that things were spiraling out of control, and I had no idea how to stop it. For the rest of the day, I avoided Nick as much as possible. I needed space, time to think. But no matter how hard I tried to push the thoughts away, they kept coming back. His words echoed in my mind, and with them came a dangerous question: what if he was right? What if I did feel something? I shook my head, trying to dispel the thought. "This is insane," I told myself. "He's your stepson. Nothing can ever happen." But deep down, I knew that things were already changing. And the worst part? A part of me didn't want to stop it. By the time evening came, the tension between us was unbearable. We barely spoke during dinner, but I could feel his eyes on me the whole time. Every glance, every movement felt charged with unspoken emotion. After dinner, I went to my room, hoping to escape the tension. But as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was only the beginning. Something was going to happen, something that would change everything. And I wasn't sure if I was ready for it. I barely had time to process what I was seeing. Nick stood there, completely naked, his eyes locked on mine without a hint of embarrassment. My breath caught in my throat, and for a moment, I didn't know what to do. This wasn't some awkward misunderstanding, this was intentional. "What are you doing?" I whispered, my voice trembling more than I wanted it to. "I can't hide it anymore," he said softly, stepping closer, his gaze unwavering. "I want you, Lisa. I've wanted you for a long time." My mind spun, torn between shock, anger, and something far more dangerous as curiosity. I should have slammed the door in his face, should have screamed at him to go back to his room. But I didn't. I just stood there, frozen in place, unable to tear my eyes away from him. "Nick, this is insane," I managed to say, my voice barely above a whisper. "You can't. We can't." "Why not?" he interrupted, his tone calm but firm. "It's just us here. No one has to know." His words sent a chill down my spine. The way he said it, so matter-of-factly, as if this was the most natural thing in the world, made my heart race even faster. I knew I had to put an end to this before it went any further, but the tension in the air was suffocating. "You need to leave," I said, forcing myself to sound firm. "Now." Nick didn't move. Instead, he took another step closer, closing the distance between us. I could feel the heat radiating from his body, and it made my pulse quicken in a way I didn't want to admit. "I know you feel it too," he said quietly, his voice barely more than a whisper. "I see the way you look at me when you think I'm not watching. You're just as curious as I am." His words hit me like a punch to the gut. Was he right? Had I been giving him the wrong signals without realizing it? My mind raced, trying to find an answer, but all I could focus on was the intensity in his eyes, the way they seemed to see right through me. "Nick, please," I said, my voice softer this time, almost pleading. "This isn't right. We can't do this." He hesitated for a moment, as if weighing his options. Then, to my relief, he took a step back. But the tension in the air didn't dissipate, it only grew stronger. "I'll go," he said finally, his voice calm but filled with something I couldn't quite place. "But don't pretend you don't feel it too. You can lie to yourself all you want, but we both know the truth." With that, he turned and walked away, leaving me standing there, my heart racing and my mind spinning. I closed the door quickly, locking it behind me as if that could somehow keep the tension at bay. But it was already too late. The seed had been planted, and no matter how much I tried to ignore it, I couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something I couldn't undo. I spent the rest of the night tossing and turning, unable to sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw Nick standing there, his gaze burning into mine. I hated myself for even thinking about it, for letting him get under my skin. This was wrong, so wrong. But the more I tried to push the thoughts away, the stronger they became. By morning, I was exhausted physically, mentally, emotionally. I tried to go about my day as if nothing had happened, but the tension lingered in the back of my mind like a shadow I couldn't escape. And when Nick finally came downstairs, acting as if everything was perfectly normal, it only made things worse. "Morning," he said casually, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Morning," I replied, trying to keep my voice steady. We sat in silence for a while, the air between us thick with unspoken tension. I wanted to say something, to clear the air, but I didn't know where to start. How do you talk about something like that? How do you tell your stepson that what happened was wrong, without making things even more awkward? As the day went on, I tried to avoid him as much as possible. I kept myself busy with chores, anything to keep my mind occupied. But no matter what I did, I couldn't shake the feeling that Nick was watching me, waiting for something. By evening, I was on edge. My husband still hadn't returned from his trip, and the thought of spending another night alone in the house with Nick made my heart race for all the wrong reasons. I told myself I was being paranoid, that nothing was going to happen. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. After dinner, I went straight to my room, locking the door behind me. I needed space, time to think. But even as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. And I was right. A soft knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. My heart skipped a beat as I sat up, my mind racing. It couldn't be him. Could it? Who is it? I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. It's me, Nick said quietly from the other side of the door. Can we talk? I hesitated, every instinct telling me to say no. But against my better judgment, I found myself getting out of bed and walking toward the door. This isn't a good time, Nick, I said, my hand resting on the door handle. We can talk tomorrow. Please, he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. I need to say something. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something else entirely. But I unlocked the door and opened it just a crack, enough to see him standing there, his expression serious. What is it? I asked, keeping my voice low. Nick didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place, something that made my pulse quicken. I'm sorry, he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. I didn't mean to make things weird. I don't know what to do with how I feel. His words caught me off guard. I had expected him to push, to try, and cross the line again. But instead, he looked vulnerable. Confused. And in that moment, I saw him not as the confident young man who had stood in my doorway the night before, but as a boy who didn't know how to handle his emotions. I took another step back, my heart pounding like a drum in my chest. I didn't want to show fear, but the truth was, I was terrified. Nick wasn't acting like himself, this wasn't the quiet, reserved boy I had known for years. There was a fire in his eyes, a determination that made my stomach twist in knots. Nick, stop it. This isn't normal. I said sharply, trying to inject some authority into my voice. You need to go back to your room. Now. But he didn't stop. He took another slow step toward me, his expression unwavering. I can't, he said quietly, his voice calm yet filled with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I can't pretend anymore, Lisa. I want you, and I know you feel it too. His words sent a shiver down my spine. How had things come to this? Just days ago, everything had been normal, or at least, I had thought it was. But now, standing there with Nick closing the distance between us, I realized that the tension that had been building wasn't one-sided. He had been feeling it too, and now, he was acting on it. I forced myself to take a deep breath, trying to steady my racing thoughts. Nick, you're confused, I said, keeping my voice as steady as I could. You don't know what you're saying. I know exactly what I'm saying, he countered, his tone unwavering. I felt this way for a long time. I just didn't know how to tell you. I shook my head, trying to keep a grip on reality. This was madness. This couldn't be happening. But the way he looked at me, with such raw honesty, made it hard to dismiss his words entirely. Even if you feel that way, I said carefully, this can't happen. It's wrong, Nick. You're my stepson. He flinched at the word, as if it stung more than he had expected. But instead of backing down, he took another step forward, his eyes locked on mine. That doesn't change how I feel. It doesn't change what's between us. There is nothing between us, I snapped, more harshly than I intended. You're imagining things. His jaw tightened, and for a moment, I thought he was going to argue. But then, something in his expression shifted. He looked hurt, vulnerable in a way I hadn't seen before. I'm not imagining it, he said softly. You feel it too. I know you do. The room fell into a tense silence, the only sound the rapid beating of my heart. I didn't know what to say, how to respond to something so impossible. Because deep down, I was afraid he might be right. There had been moments, fleeting but undeniable, when I had felt something, a spark, a tension that I couldn't explain. But admitting that, even to myself, was dangerous. "You need to go," I said finally, my voice trembling. "Please, Nick. Just go." For a moment, he didn't move. He just stood there, watching me with an intensity that made it hard to breathe. But then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay," he said quietly. "I'll go. But this isn't over." The weight of his words hung in the air long after he left the room. I closed the door behind him, locking it firmly before sinking down onto the bed. My hands were shaking, and my mind was a whirlwind of conflicting emotions. What had just happened? How had things spiraled so far out of control? I spent the rest of the night wide awake, haunted by Nick's words and the look in his eyes. He wasn't giving up, that much was clear. And the worst part? A small, treacherous part of me didn't want him to. By morning, I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. I tried to go about my day as if nothing had happened, but the tension lingered in the back of my mind, refusing to be ignored. And when Nick finally appeared, acting as if nothing had changed, it only made things worse. "Good morning," he said casually, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Morning," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. But inside, I was anything but calm. Every glance, every word felt loaded with unspoken tension, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending that everything was fine. As the day wore on, the tension only grew. Nick found excuses to be near me, his presence a constant reminder of the night before. I tried to keep my distance, but no matter how hard I tried, I couldn't escape the lingering sense of inevitability, that this was building towards something I couldn't control. By evening, I was on edge. My husband still hadn't returned from his trip, and the thought of spending another night alone in the house with Nick made my heart race for all the wrong reasons. I told myself I was being paranoid, that nothing was going to happen. But deep down, I wasn't so sure. After dinner, I went straight to my room, locking the door behind me. I needed space, time to think. But even as I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, I couldn't shake the feeling that this was far from over. And I was right. A soft knock on the door pulled me from my thoughts. My heart skipped a beat as I sat up, my mind racing. It couldn't be him. Could it? "Who is it?" I called out, trying to keep my voice steady. "It's me," Nick said quietly from the other side of the door. "Can we talk?" I hesitated, every instinct telling me to say no. But against my better judgment, I found myself getting out of bed and walking toward the door. "This isn't a good time, Nick," I said, my hand resting on the door handle. "We can talk tomorrow." "Please," he said, his voice softer now, almost pleading. I need to say something. I don't know why I did it. Maybe it was curiosity, maybe it was something else entirely. But I unlocked the door and opened it just a crack, enough to see him standing there, his expression serious. "What is it?" I asked, keeping my voice low. Nick didn't answer right away. He just looked at me, his eyes filled with something I couldn't quite place, something that made my pulse quicken. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice barely above a whisper. "I didn't mean to make things weird. I don't know what to do with how I feel." His words caught me off guard. I had expected him to push, to try, and cross the line again. But instead, he looked vulnerable. Confused. And in that moment, I saw him not as the confident young man who had stood in my doorway the night before, but as a boy who didn't know how to handle his emotions. Nick took another step forward, and that's when it hit me, he wasn't joking. His eyes burned with determination, and I could feel the intensity radiating off him. This wasn't some impulsive teenage crush. He wanted me, and he wasn't hiding it anymore. "We can't do this," I said sharply, my voice trembling despite my effort to stay composed. "I'm your stepmother, Nick. This is wrong." He paused, and for a moment, I thought my words had finally gotten through to him. But the look on his face didn't change. If anything, it grew more serious. "Why does it have to be wrong?" he asked quietly. "We're not related by blood. No one has to know." His words sent a wave of shock through me. How could he be so calm, so sure of himself? I was struggling to hold it together, and he was standing there like this was just a normal conversation. "Stop it, Nick," I said, my voice firmer this time. "Go back to your room. Now." For a moment, he didn't move. The tension between us was unbearable. Then, slowly, he stepped back, his gaze never leaving mine. But before he turned to leave, he said something that sent shivers down my spine. "You feel it too. You're just afraid to admit it." As soon as he was gone, I slammed the door shut and locked it, my hands trembling uncontrollably. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it might burst out of my chest. What had just happened? How had things gotten as far? I leaned against the door, trying to steady my breathing. But no matter how much I tried to calm down, Nick's words kept echoing in my head. "You feel it too." Was he right? Had I been giving him mixed signals without realizing it? I shook my head, trying to banish the thought. This was insane. I was his stepmother. Nothing could ever happen between us. But even as I told myself that, a part of me couldn't forget the look in his eyes, the way he made me feel, even if I didn't want to admit it. The rest of the night was a blur. I barely slept, my mind racing with questions I couldn't answer. By morning, I was exhausted, both physically and emotionally. I tried to go about my day as if nothing had happened, but the tension lingered, a constant reminder of the line we had almost crossed. When Nick finally appeared, he acted as if everything was normal. But I could feel the weight of what had happened hanging between us, unspoken but undeniable. "Morning," he said casually, pouring himself a cup of coffee. "Morning," I replied, keeping my voice neutral. But inside, I was anything but calm. Every glance, every word felt loaded with tension, and I didn't know how much longer I could keep pretending that everything was fine. For the next few days, things were strange. Nick didn't bring up what had happened, and neither did I. But the tension between us was palpable, like a storm waiting to break. Every time we were in the same room, I felt like I was walking on a tightrope, trying not to fall. And then, one evening, he caught me off guard again. I was in the kitchen, cleaning up after dinner, when he walked in. For a moment, neither of us said anything. The silence was heavy, filled with unspoken things that neither of us wanted to say out loud. "I'm sorry," he said suddenly, his voice quiet but sincere. I looked up, surprised. "For what?" "For making things weird," he said, his eyes meeting mine. "I shouldn't have. I just didn't know how to handle how I felt." His honesty caught me off guard. I didn't know what to say. Part of me wanted to brush it off, to pretend it never happened. But another part of me knew that wouldn't work. "It's okay," I said finally, keeping my voice calm. "We all get confused sometimes. But we can't let this happen again, Nick. It's complicated." "I know," he said, nodding slowly. I just needed to say it. For a moment, we stood there in silence. And then, without another word, he turned and walked away. That was the last time we ever spoke about it. Things slowly went back to normal, or as normal as they could be after everything that had happened. But even now, I can't help but wonder, what if? What if I hadn't stopped him that night? What if things had gone further? It's a question that still lingers in the back of my mind, even though I know it's one I'll never have the answer to. Some things are better left unspoken. And that's how it ended, or did it? What do you think I should have done? Should I have handled things differently? Let me know in the comments. I really want to hear your thoughts.